We're delighted today to be opening our fall series with a visit from Fred Bahnson, Director of the Food, Faith and Religious Leadership Initiative at Wake Forest University School of Divinity, author of Soil and Sacrament, a spiritual memoir of food and faith, and co-author of Making Peace with the Land. The Kirkus Review describes Soil and Sacrament as a soul-searching memoir and travelogue about finding God in the food produced by community agriculture, while Publishers Weekly praises the book for introducing us to people of deep faith, imprisoned pasts, ticklish humour, and hope-filled vision. Fred Banson's work takes its place, as his titles might suggest, in a rich American agrarian tradition that goes back as far as Thomas Jefferson and includes such contemporary figures as the farmer-poet Wendell Berry. After being drawn to the agrarian life while serving as a peace worker among Mayan coffee workers in Chiapas, Mexico, Fred returned to the US and in 2005 co-founded the Anshoff Community Garden, a church-supported agricultural ministry in Cedar Grove, North Carolina, which he directed until 2009, and which in a recent TED Talk he described as his congregation of plants. It was here that he began to think more deeply about how soil, a word he connects with soul, could be a channel of divine love and mercy in its ability to feed people, and how working the land could be connected to the fostering of social justice and community building, an idea that has brought him into contact and conversation with, among many others, monks raising oyster mushrooms in South Carolina, Pentecostal coffee roasters in Washington, and young Jewish farmers right here in Connecticut. Fred's essays on the life of the land and the life of the spirit have appeared in Oxford American, Image, Christian Science Monitor, Orion, The Sun, Christian Century, and the anthologies Best American Spiritual Writing and State of the World, Innovations That Nourish the Planet. He has received numerous awards for his writing, including a 2006 Pilgrimage Essay Award, a 2008 William Rainey Scholarship in Creative Nonfiction at the Breadloaf Writers Conference, a 2009 Kellogg Food and Community Fellowship, and a 2012 North Carolina Artist Fellowship in Creative Nonfiction from the North Carolina Arts Council. He lives with his wife and 3 sons in Transylvania County, North Carolina. Please welcome Fred Bahnson.
The garden is our oldest metaphor. In Genesis, God creates the first Adam from the Adamah and tells him to till and keep it, the fertile soil in which all life depends, human from humus. That's our first etymological clue as to the inextricable bond we share with the soil. Our ecological problems are a result of having forgotten who we are, soil people, inspired by the breath of God. Earth's hallowed mold is how Milton referred to Adam in Paradise Lost, or in St. Augustine's phrase, terra animata, animated earth. Well, thank you for having me. Thanks to Professor Kieran Berry and others for inviting me, and it's great to be with you. So I just flew up this morning from Asheville, North Carolina, where I live in a small town with my wife and our 3 boys. We have a small farm there. We raise most of our own vegetables and fruits. And we sort of do the home food subsistence economy. And so I'm happy to take your questions about food and farming and gardening and all of that. But I have to say, as someone who travels and speaks a good bit about food stuff, it's really nice to come and just be among writers and to talk writing. And to come as a writer, it's a real honor and a gift. So I'm looking forward to any questions you might have about creative nonfiction, essays, memoir, spiritual autobiography, any of the above. I look forward to talking with you. So I thought I would give a few short readings and talk a bit in between, and then take your questions. Okay? So I want to tell you a bit of the story of this book, which is, it's called Soil and Sacrament. And my publisher decided to use some nice garden porn imagery here on the cover. And they also decided to call it a memoir. And it's partly memoir, but I also think of it as kind of a hybrid work of literary nonfiction. It's part memoir, it's part essay, it's part nature writing, part theological diatribe. To my publisher, it's hard to put all that in a cover, so they just called it a memoir. So I want to read to you from a section of how I got into this whole food and land care thing. I didn't grow up with any interest in food. I grew up in Montana as a skier and a climber. Loved the outdoors, but really had no interest in food or farming. Thought that was just something that ranchers did, right? In 2001, after graduating from divinity school and sort of searching for my way in life, I ended up in Chiapas, Mexico, working with a group of Mayan coffee farmers. And these folks were indigenous Mayan. Tzotzil was and is their first language. Spanish is their second language. And they're Mayan Catholics, and they make their living as coffee farmers. And I went down there working as a peace worker at the tail end of the low-intensity war there in Chiapas. Some of you may have heard about the Zapatistas and that whole uprising. So I sort of got enamored with that, and I went down there as a peace worker, and ended up realizing I wasn't much of an activist, but I really became interested in this whole food growing thing. So I'm going to read you a section where my friend Jose and I go out and work in his coffee fields after having breakfast together. This takes place during Holy Week. When Maundy Thursday arrived, Jose came as promised at 6 a.m., knocking quietly on the door of the campamentista hut where I stayed. I left behind my warm sleeping bag, dressed quickly, and followed him into the brisk dawn air. The village of Nuevo Yibeljo was just waking up. Two sleepy-eyed twin boys sat in a dirt doorway, waiting for their breakfast. The smoke of 100 campfires rose above the ravine to mingle with low-hanging clouds. On the way to Jose's hut, we walked past dozens of thrown-together shacks, all clinging tenaciously to the mountainside like baby spiders gripping their mother's back. By the time we arrived at Jose's home, the morning fog had begun to lift. His wife, Angelina, had breakfast waiting. Her kitchen, built next to the house, was the size of my closet back home. The house itself, little more than a scrap metal roof supported by 4 spindly corner posts with plastic sheeting to approximate walls. Despite its ramshackle construction, though, it was full of familial cheer. Breakfast at Jose's was a never-ending source of pleasure. He and his clan had become my surrogate family. The food that morning was delicious. We spoke little and ate with our hands. I folded the Vaak, the tortilla, and used it to scoop up the chenek, the slow-cooked black beans that, along with the Vaak, were part of every meal. I watched Angelina make Vaak. Earlier, she had ground the corn on an ancient mortar and pestle handed down to her from her mother, who received it from her mother and hers before. The corn was already soft from soaking for several days in lime water. Lime releases niacin in the corn and prevents pellagra, a disease caused by niacin deficiency. From the ground and doughy masa, Angelina pulled off a handful, patted it flat, and slapped it down on the hot oil drum sitting above the fire grate. When air pockets formed, she picked up an edge and flipped it. When it was cool, she placed it in a cloth to keep warm. The more I ate Vaak and chenek, the more I detected subtle differences in flavor and texture. With Jose's direction, I even began to distinguish regional differences in the tortillas based on whether the corn was grown in tierra caliente, the hot lowlands, or tierra alta, the cooler highlands. Using Tzotzil words was as much a part of the mysterious pleasure I derived from eating this food as the elements themselves. So much so that the food, the words, and the people who fed me were all becoming inseparable in my mind. To speak Tzotzil while eating Vaak and Chenek was to partake of an ancient and unnamed mystery, an unnamed liturgy. I was eating my way into mystery. Man's real work, writes Robert Farrar Capon in his wonderful book, The Supper of the Lamb, is to look at things of this world and to love them for what they are. That is, after all, what God does, and man was not made in God's image for nothing. And he's writing in the 60s, so he's still using sexist language here for people. If Capon is right, then maybe I was doing God's work in Chiapas after all, meal by meal. I looked upon Vaak and Chenek and loved them for what they were. But the food was not an end in itself. By imbibing the world around me over and over, I came to love the people who lived in that world. Hach kanto hutuk kakosh? I asked in Tzotzil. And I realized that rattling it off like that makes it sound like I actually speak Tzotzil, and you just heard the extent of my Tzotzil knowledge there. But I got that phrase down. Hach kanto hutuk kakosh? I asked, could I have a little more kakosh? It was my new favorite food, Vaak, that had been thrown directly onto the coals, where it turned smoky and brittle. Angelina reached toward the fire, squinting against the smoke, and placed 2 kakosh on my plate. They were the size of dinner plates, dark brown with bits of ash still clinging to them. I broke off a piece, blew on it, and then sprinkled on salt and a few pieces of diced jalapeno. It was smoky and warm and tasted like the land itself, like sun and soil and rain and the campfires of my boyhood. Soon it would be time to go. Jose and I washed down our meal with a last cup of sweet, weak coffee, grown on the very cafetales we would soon weed, the very coffee bushes we would soon weed, but neither of us wanted to leave. I sat for what seemed a very long time on that tiny elf stool in Jose's kitchen. His children murmured contentedly at our feet as their bellies filled with warmth. Here was domestic bliss of another sort, entirely pared down, stripped of extraneous goods. Here was a family utterly connected to this piece of land. It could have been 100 years ago, or even 1,000. The food, the fire, even the air itself seemed to hum with a sense of divine approval. There was nothing beyond this moment. There was no place else I wanted to be. This clarity was what I had come to Chiapas to find. Jose and I hiked up a series of ridges that rose up the mountain behind his house, and in another 20 minutes, we arrived at his field, an acre of coffee trees. With no equipment other than machetes, we whacked the large woody weeds and laid them against the slope, where their decomposing bodies would prevent erosion and also nurse the hungry coffee trees. Up here among Jose's cafetales, its coffee trees, my job was straightforward. Scrape, pull, chop, sweep, gather, spread. This was simple work, not a grand practice of resistance or protest. Jose and his family produced Vaak and Chenek and cafe, which rooted them to the land in a way that was palpable and intimate and went far beyond a sentimental love of nature. That was the lure I found irresistible. In growing food, they were co-creators with God. Jose cared for his small plot with a knowledge that could come only from a long tenure on this place, and with the belief that his children and their children and their children's children would need this land in order to live. Jose and his family embodied the Hebrew understanding of peace as shalom. The peace shalom entails is not the absence of conflict. It is a completeness, an expansive wholeness, where God, people, and land dwell together in harmony. Perhaps, I began to think, I might only find shalom in the fields in which if the fields in which I toiled were not just metaphors, but were as real as this one. Jose and I worked most of the day. Before we parted, he handed me a bag. It was full of seeds, beautiful, shiny yellow seeds. They were from his own maíz, his own corn. Los sembras en su propio suelo, he said in Spanish. Plant them in your own soil. Well, I did plant them. When I returned to the States, and they promptly got eaten by crows. Every last seed. A couple hundred of them, all planted on this hillside above my parents' house. Because back then I had no idea what the hell I was doing. And I just kind of stuck them in the ground. I got a stick, a planting stick like I'd seen Jose and his friends use. And of course their soil had been prepared ahead of time. And this hill above my parents' house was just a bunch of sod, just like the yard out there. I went out there and stuck them in the ground and came back a few days later, and sure enough, the crows had just pecked right through that thin layer of soil and eaten every last seed. Beautiful heirloom seeds of maíz from Chiapas, the cradle of corn, where corn came from. And I lost it. So I need to go back and get some more seeds from my friend Jose and smuggle them once again across the border. It's fun to smuggle stuff over the border. I've smuggled back coca leaves from Bolivia, which is what cocaine comes from, obviously, right? But as leaves, they're benign. They're about as mild as drinking a cup of tea. In fact, that's what people use them for. You make coca tea. It's mildly euphoric. It helps you with altitude. Totally legal, right? It's only when you dump kerosene in there and mash it in with a whole bunch of other terrible ingredients that it becomes something illegal. And I have no interest in that. But the coca leaves themselves are great. You can make a really good tea with them. So much for illegal activities. After I came back from Chiapas and planted these seeds, a seed had been planted in me, this interest of wanting to learn how to grow food. And I went to work on a permaculture farm. Has anybody ever heard the word permaculture? So it's kind of like Uber organics, right? It's sort of like using the local ecosystem as a model for how you create your farm. Using indigenous knowledge like Jose's. And so I learned some of these basic skills and met my wife Elizabeth. We got married and bought a little farm in North Carolina. We started growing our own food and raising hogs and chickens. And in 2005, I was asked by a small Methodist church to help start a community garden. And it was this amazing thing where a woman donated land. There was a murder that precipitated her giving this land to the community, and it's a whole long story that I tell in the book. And it's too long to tell here. But it was this amazing project, and I got to be part of that for 4 years, and learned how to grow food on a community-wide level, and we were growing food for about 60, 70 people a week, organic vegetables and fruits. And I did that for 4 years, and I realized in that process that I loved growing food, but working with people is a bit of a challenge, especially when you're a sort of hermit writer type, as I realized I was. And I found myself more and more sort of pulling back and taking notes about these stories and these people I was meeting at this garden. And at the end of my 4 years, well, I had been there 4 years, and I received a really nice writing grant that allowed me to sort of take a step back for a couple of years. And I turned over the reins of the garden to one of my interns. The garden still continues. But I was really interested in traveling around and meeting other people who were starting these gardens, these community gardens. And I was especially interested in people of faith doing this because it seemed like the larger kind of Michael Pollan food movement was happening on one level. I'm sure you guys have heard, Barbara Kingsolver's book. There's all kinds of interest in food culturally right now. There has been for the past 5 years or so. But I didn't feel like those stories of faith communities were getting told. And so I wanted to go and visit some of them. And so I set out to visit 8 communities. And I was also writing a book proposal, and I got a book agent to help me find a publisher. And she said, no, you can't do 8 communities. That's just insane. Let's narrow it down. And so I ultimately landed on 4 communities. And I visited one for each season. And in each season, I timed my visit with a liturgical holiday. And so the first place that I went was to visit a group of Trappist monks down in the South Carolina Low Country. Have you guys heard of the Trappists? They're part of the Benedictine tradition. Is this a Catholic school by heritage?
Episcopalian.
Episcopalian, okay. So the Benedictine tradition is probably the oldest Christian agrarian tradition in the world. It's about 1,500 years old, right? These monastics, these Benedictine Catholic monastics, have lived on the land. Now a lot of them make beer and fruitcakes, but for a good many centuries they were farming, they were growing their own food. So I started with the Trappists, and I want to read to you a short little section of my visit there. And as I go through these communities, I'm just going to give you a short taste of a couple of them. This Trappist community, these guys, they're all men, celibate men, and they pray 7 times throughout the day, beginning at 3 a.m. They get up at 3, and they pray 7 times throughout the day, and they work in between. And that's their life, 24/7, 365. And so I entered into that life with them for a week. And I got up at 3, and I worked with them in their mushroom operation. And this takes place about 6:30 in the morning, right after the prayer service of Lauds. After Lauds came breakfast in the refectory, a reminder that being a monk is harder than it looks. I'd been to the abbey twice before on shorter visits, and I'd learned that the monks don't eat very much. Breakfast consists of a few thin slices of pumpernickel bread, a slice of cheese, maybe some PB&J. Supper is not much different. Though they occasionally eat fish, Trappists are otherwise vegetarian. The main meal at noon was always a hearty affair, butternut squash and lentil curry, or rice with oyster mushroom lasagna and fresh garden salad. But the daily caloric intake still left me in a constant state of hunger, which is the idea. By ordering our bodily desires, fasting helps us better understand ourselves. Being less occupied about the tasks of preparing and consuming food, we can use that energy to turn our thoughts inward and give in to our desire for God. Nonetheless, on this third trip to Mebken Abbey, the name of this monastery, I decided that while I would engage the rigors of bodily denial at some meals, I would also bring a cooler of food, which could be secretly stashed in the guest fridge. Just to back up, a little something to take the edge off. Elizabeth sent along a big loaf of her peasant bread, jam, and hummus, all of it homemade. I packed organic almond butter, bananas, and oranges. For suppers, I brought fresh winter produce from our garden: Napoli carrots, Hakurei turnips, winter boar kale. To maintain healthy intestinal function during my week of spiritual rigor, I brought a big jar of home-fermented kimchi, loaded with lactobacilli and probiotics. I know it sounds like I was bringing Oreos to fat camp, but aside from skipping vigils, the early prayer, a few times, my mealtime laxity was my one concession to an otherwise complete adoption of the rigors of Trappist life. Okay, that's not the whole truth. I confess I did smuggle in several beers and a bottle of single malt for nightcaps. St. Benedict's rule was a good invention, I realized, but it needed the addition of cocktail hour to make it complete. As I stood one morning in front of the open guest fridge perusing my secret stash, Brother Dismas walked over to fill his coffee. In the hours between vigils and lauds, when most monks were deep into their spiritual reading, between the hours of 4 a.m. and 6 a.m., Brother Dismas was down in the laundry room rowing. It was his only time of day for exercise, and so the abbot agreed. By the way, he would also get up at 2 a.m. to write confessional poetry before his day actually began at 3. So that's some poetic discipline right there. Uncovering the hidden beers in the fridge, I tipped my right hand, thumb to mouth, pinky extended, and looked at Brother Dismas. Did he want to join me for one, a cold one, that evening? He grasped my shoulder and whispered, "Bless you, my son, bless you." "Gaelic ale or fat tire?" I whispered back. "Oh, I'm a fat tire man, for sure," he said. We agreed to meet that night after Vespers in the little dining room, and then it was time for Mass, and we hurried off through the breezeway toward the church. So Brother Dismas, as a young man in his vigor, he was 23 when I met him. He'd been in the monastery 7 years. And there's a little coda to his story. After I was at the monastery, I heard a few months later that Brother Dismas left. He'd been there 7 years, and he realized, young man that he was no longer called to the life of celibacy. Now, I know you all are called to the life of celibacy, so you may have a hard time understanding this. But he decided he wanted to be out in the world, and the way he broke the news to his brothers, he said, "I want to take a brunette out for coffee. I want to take a brunette out for coffee." And you can picture these monks gathered together, most of them in their 80s. And they came up to him afterward, they gave him their blessing and sent him on his way with goodwill. But after the meeting, one of the older brothers came up in his 80s, and he laid a hand on Brother Dismas' shoulder and said, "Dismas, for God's sake, don't limit yourself to brunettes." That was his parting advice. You gotta love monks. But in the spring, in the season of Eastertide, I went to visit the Lord's Acre, which is a community garden in western North Carolina. And this garden grows 9 tons of organic produce on a half an acre. The Lord's Acre is actually a half of an acre. And they donate that produce to the local food pantry right down the road. And it's an amazing project. And one of the garden managers there, Susan Sides, I got to spend most of the spring hanging out with her. And I love the way she describes their work. She says, by growing and sharing fresh food with our neighbors, we're making love visible. This is how we make love visible, is feeding people. And as some of you probably know, food pantries are often bereft of good, nourishing food. There's a lot of calories there. There's a lot of just stuff to fill your bellies. But it's not deep, nourishing, healthy food like we would want. And so this is how they can supply that lack to their local food pantry. In the interest of time, I won't read from that chapter. But there's a great story of the stolen watermelons and how they, a woman who, well, I won't tell the story because it would take too long. In the summertime, in the Feast of Pentecost, I went to, appropriately, a Pentecostal farm. And I arrived on Pentecost Sunday. And this farm is out in the Skagit Valley of Washington, out in the big agricultural valley, where a lot of the nation's fruits are grown. Blackberries, blueberries, strawberries, and tulips. Big agricultural region. And there's a ministry there called Tierra Nueva, which means New Earth. And they work with folks who have addictions, people who are struggling with drug addictions mainly, but also people in gangs. And they try to give people jobs, people with criminal records. They try to give them a job on their organic vegetable farm or in their coffee business, the underground coffee roasting business. They buy beans from Honduran roasters or Honduran farmers, and they have employees with criminal backgrounds who roast the coffee, and they sell it mostly to churches. And so it's kind of a social enterprise model. And so I went out and hung out with these guys for about a week, guys and gals. And these folks have a pretty interesting theology, you might say. They definitely believe in demon possession, and they sometimes engage in glossolalia, speaking in tongues. The first night I went to their prayer service, and they formed a prayer tunnel, which is, picture a line of people, a single file line, running down the room facing each other. And you take turns walking through the prayer tunnel. It's kind of like running the gauntlet, except instead of getting hit, you get prayed for. And so you walk through in a posture of receiving, and people lay hands on you and pray for you. And that, when they said they were going to start a prayer tunnel, that was the moment in my participant observer role when I wanted to be the observer, not the participant. But I sort of got peer pressured by the Pentecostals, and I ended up going through the line, and it was a pretty amazing experience. But I want to read just the opening of that chapter, and this is sort of a little example of how you can sort of slip some nature writing into your nonfiction as a way of commenting on what you're going to say, what you're saying in another place in the essay. So I was trying to think of how you write about Pentecostals. It's obviously somewhat of a difficult thing to write about, because on the one hand, it's a bit easy to make fun of them, right? It's a little strange what they do, speaking in tongues, speaking in foreign languages. So I wanted to find a way to take their experience as authentic. And so I wrote about the river that flows through their valley, because it seemed to have some metaphorical resonance of these larger forces at work. The Skagit River in Washington State is an unstoppable slurry of life. For eons, it carried microbes and minerals, storm-chipped and glacially melted, bore them hastily from the high cascades down steep mountain canyons, nudged them slowly across the valley floor, and finally disgorged its load of life into Puget Sound. Before all that life from on high was lost, however, some of it became soil. From time to time, the river rose over the levees and edged outward, like a quilt spreading itself across the wide lap of the valley. For the land waiting to receive it, the influx of carbon-rich alluvia was a riparian gift, a transfer of energy whereby the mountains shared their bounty with the valley through the wonder-working power of the river. The river was the medium, a force ever present and still at work in unseen ways. The river rises while the valley sleeps, rises in spite of human attempts at its control, filling the land with life. It is the work of rivers and the detritus of mountains that makes civilization possible. I once visited Wes Jackson, one of the godfathers of the organic farming movement, at his home on the shortgrass prairie of Kansas. You know, the pyramids weren't built by humans, he said. They were built by the Nile. Monsoons chipped nutrients from the Ethiopian mountains, West explained, and sent them down the Blue Nile. The steamy jungles of Africa sent organic matter down the White Nile. Where those two rivers joined, they formed the Mother River itself, which created the fertile soils of the Nile Delta. Those soils provided the carbon that fed the workers who built the pyramids. An ecospheric process, West said, in which humans were just the unwitting agents. One of the guys I met there was named Zach Joy, and Zach was a former heroin addict and also a crystal meth cook. He made his living cooking meth. And when they were starting up this coffee business, they were looking for a chief coffee roaster. And they realized they knew somebody who knew how to cook. They knew somebody who had some chemistry skills. And Zach was wanting to take on a position of leadership and in this ministry organization. And so this was the perfect job for him. And so his skills, he didn't have to leave behind. They just got repurposed to better ends. And I love that. That's one of the themes of all the communities I visited, is the sense that life is always, there's always a wholeness waiting to be embraced. And Zach embraced it in a beautiful way, and he's now producing coffee. And each batch of beans that comes out into the cooling tray, he blesses and sends them on their way. The last community I visited was a Jewish farm in Connecticut, right here. Has anybody heard of Adamah Farm? A few nods. So it's over in Falls Village, over in the Berkshires, way western part of the state. And I went in the fall, and the Jewish farm emerges in my narrative as the kind of hero, the kind of model example of how you blend soil and sacrament, how you blend life and liturgy, food and faith. And I had an amazing time. I spent a week at this Jewish farm during the Feast of Sukkot, which is the fall harvest festival. And I got to work on their farm and milk the goats, make kimchi. And one of the most amazing things there was the practice of Shabbat. On Friday night, they turned off cell phones and computers. Work stopped. We had these long, lingering meals down by the lake. We were singing songs late into the night, drinking wine. It was this beautiful blend of prayers and food and music, and it lasted for 24 hours. And it was really cool to be there on a farm when that was happening. And so I want to read a short little section here to conclude, and then I want to take your questions. This is some of the folks who work on this farm. It's called Adamah Farm, Adam from Adamah, human from humus. The young people who work there are called Adamanics, and they come and work for 3 months at a time and learn the arts of organic agriculture and Jewish spirituality. They get up at 6 a.m., which is a little more manageable than the monks, and they begin each day with davening, with prayer. And so I want to read a little section on Shabbat, and you'll meet a few of these Adamanics. And then I'll end with this reading and take your questions. Short reading. So late that afternoon of Shabbat, I grabbed a book by Abraham Joshua Heschel called The Sabbath, and I walked out on the dock of Lake Miriam. I looked across the water to the red yurt where I had davened, prayed that morning. The oblique rays of the setting sun warmed my bones, and I opened Heschel's pages. The faith of the Jew, Heschel began, is not a way out of this world, but a way of being within and above this world, not to reject, but to surpass civilization. The Sabbath is the day on which we learn the art of surpassing civilization. Civilization was not something to be abandoned or reformed or protested against. No, Heschel said, you must be in this world, but also above it. You must transcend it. One of the many ways Heschel chose to surpass civilization was to march in Selma alongside Martin Luther King Jr. Yet it seemed that Jews were surpassing civilization every week in their practice of Sabbath. I was eager to celebrate my first Shabbat that Friday evening, which still seemed like a long way off. Soon the sun dipped behind the mountains to the west, and late afternoon shadows slid across the dock, chilling my arms. Time for supper. I walked over to the lodge and hopped on a bike that one of the Adamanics had loaned me, and I rode a mile or so down to the Beit Adamah, which is the house of soil. Literally, house of soil. Beit Adamah was a fitting name for this abode of young farmers. That night, 3 of those young farmers had cooked up a feast from the land's bounty. Sautéed kale, challah, couscous with fresh carrots, vegetarian lasagna, and some mysterious fried balls that looked like falafel. Most of the Adamanics present that night were girls, and the double entendres were running high. Could you pass the balls? One girl asked. Oh, I'm so pleased you like my balls, another replied. Giggles. I sat down next to Javi, whom I'd met earlier that afternoon at the sukkah. The sukkah is the open-air tent during the Feast of Sukkot where you eat meals. Javi reminded me of my younger sister, open, friendly, earnest. She grew up in a strict Orthodox home in upstate New York. She asked if I had any questions about Judaism she could answer, and I asked her to translate some of the new words that I'd learned that day. Daven, pray, shul, synagogue. I told her how much I liked the different Hebrew names for God. Yahweh, I am that I am. Adonai, Lord. Shekhinah, the feminine presence of God. Hashem, the name. And then I asked about a strange sight I'd seen earlier on the lake dock. A curtain hanging suspended from a horizontal pole. That's for the mikveh, she explained. It's a ritual bath. Though men sometimes participate in a mikveh before Shabbat or a big holiday or other significant events, traditionally a mikveh is the ritual bath a woman takes after her period. It's the culmination of a long process of purification, Javi explained, during which she cannot lie with a man, with her husband. The mikveh usually happens about the time a woman would be ovulating, she continued, and after a long hiatus, her desire for her husband will be very strong. Javi explained all this in a slightly detached, sociological tone, as if there were nothing odd about a married man and a single young woman discussing such things. Here at the House of Soil, Beit Adamah, menstrual cycles and mikvahs and the procreative acts that followed were perfectly legitimate topics for dinnertime conversation. It all came back to fertility. Stanley Hauerwas, one of my teachers at divinity school, liked to quote a Jewish theologian friend of his who said this: any religion that doesn't tell you what to do with your pots and pans and your genitals just ain't worth a damn. Amen. Please pass the balls. And I'll stop there and take your questions. So, comments, anything?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I spent 2 weeks on a farm in Pennsylvania when
Yeah.
I was a kid, and it was the hardest work I've ever done in my entire life.
Mm.
Cured me of wanting to be a farmer ever.
Yeah.
I was wondering, what are your writing habits when you're also running a full-time subsistence farm?
My writing habits, yeah. Well, I'm a bad example of how to be a habitual writer. But when I'm working on a project, when I was working on this book, or when I'm deep into an essay, it's got to be daily for me, and to keep the thread going, to be immersed in that narrative, I need to be doing it every day. And so for me, that means getting up at 5 or 6 and putting in at least a couple of hours writing before the day begins. And now I'm kind of an academic, not getting outside as much as I want to, and so I'm trying to get back to that discipline. But especially when I was working at Anatoth Garden for those 4 years, I find it's a really good back and forth to go from manual labor to writing. Because when you're not at your desk, when you're out working on a farm or a garden or doing any kind of physical work, it's repetitive work, and it kind of gets your mind in this kind of deeply meditative state. And I think it has to be more than just like a 20-minute run, although that's great, But those long sort of couple-hour stretches where you're doing manual labor, your mind just kind of works. And so you're writing during that time. And so when you go back and sit at your desk, it comes easier. At least that's how I've found it. Yes.
How does your work for folks who may not have faith or don't know what to do with the word God, or or do you think of your audience as people of faith or people who have a nuanced understanding of God or not?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I wrote this book very much for a general audience. And I think what I'm trying to do in my writing is, and I realize I'm using potentially loaded words like God and faith, but what I'm trying to do is get past that polarization in our society where we have sort of God talk over here and anti-God talk over here, and there's just a lot of polarization that happens whenever you start talking about faith and spirituality and religion. And so the writers I admire and try to emulate are people like Marilynne Robinson, who's a fantastic novelist, and she's read by people of no faith persuasion, all faith persuasion. I mean, she's got a wide readership, and so, or short stories like Tobias Wolff, who's a Catholic, and there's a faith that will creep into his work at times. It's definitely more subdued, I think, than someone like Marilynne Robinson. But all that's to say, I think there's a middle ground where the writer can be a person of faith unapologetically, in a sense of you don't have to hide your faith, but to write in such a way that the story is primary, and we get to all come together and inhabit this third space of the story, where it's not something that the writer is trying to convince the reader of or argue someone into believing what they believe, but I think the goal is to have a narrative where anyone can come and inhabit that space for a while. Now, whether I pull that off, I don't know. That's for the reader to decide. But that's my goal as a writer, is to not try to convince someone of my beliefs, but neither to hide them, and to say this is the story I'm trying to tell, and it may be of interest to you. So I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but thank you.
Students, who's feeling brave?
Anyone? There are no bad questions. Do we have any writers here among the students? Yes.
When did you start writing?
When did I start writing?
Yeah, like, as like a...
Yeah. Well, I went to divinity school in the late 90s, and I learned a style of academic writing that I'm still trying to unlearn. And that is this idea that you really can't say anything on your own, that you have to quote other people, right? And you have to make an argument. And so I had to unlearn a lot of that to become a creative writer, an essayist, to write the kind of creative nonfiction that I do. And for me, that really began, I wrote an essay about my climbing years back in the early 2000s. And it was like a story I had to tell. I lost a close friend of mine in the mountains. I was not there on the expedition when he died. He died in Chamonix in a skiing accident. My friend Hans, he was skiing a 60-degree couloir, the kind of level of steepness that most people climb, and he was skiing it. And he died skiing in Chamonix, and it had a profound impact on me. And we've been close as friends, we've been climbing partners, and I just had to tell that story. And so I worked for probably a year on this 7,000 word essay. And that's what kind of started it for me. And I just got consumed by the process. And I'm still consumed by it. I find it just a wonderful thing to sit down and try to put your thoughts to words and to see this other thing that's part of you, but that's also separate from you emerge. It's a really captivating process. Yeah.
How did you unlearn that?
How did I unlearn the academic writing?
Any advice?
Yeah, I think however you can get that little critic off your shoulder, that little internal critic that sits here and tells you everything you write is not good enough. So that's one start, is getting rid of the internal critic, at least enough to get a first draft down. But in terms of unlearning the argument and the thesis and all that, I would say read really good writers, whatever kind of writing you aspire to, whether it's poetry or fiction, creative nonfiction. Just immerse yourself in the best writers, and start trying to emulate them. And you'll find, especially with nonfiction, that the form is I find it a really capacious form. You can pull in so many different voices and styles into that form. So that's a good place to start. Fiction and poetry, they seem a little more daunting, at least to me. But nonfiction, you can just try to tell a true story that's happened from your life, or about someone you know. That's a good starting place.
Do you have another project, book-length project in the works, or?
Yeah, I have a couple of Moleskine notebooks full of narrative snippets and false starts, but nothing so far has emerged as a book-length project. I do hope to write a book about mountains, and I don't know if that's next, but I hope to write about sort of like I use the garden as a continuing metaphor in this book. I want to use the mountain in that same sense and tell stories from my years as a climber, but not in an outside magazine kind of way, more as an essayist. And I want to write a novel. That's my aspiration as a writer. Yeah. But I find it really terrifying. Fiction is terrifying.
You
Yeah.
said something interesting about sort of the idea of authenticity in terms of trying to bring, have an authentic experience sort of as a writer, but also trying to sort of convey the authentic experience of the people that you were sort of meeting. And I was wondering how that was something that you managed and sort of kept track of as you were doing it.
How I managed the authenticity.
How you managed, yeah, like, were you sort of keeping track of that, and sort of particularly talking about sort of the experiences of other people, right? How did you sort of keep track of yourself as you were writing these? Keeping yourself in their experience or out of their experiences? How did you sort of monitor that?
Yeah, boy, that's a great question. I think it was more of an unconscious process for me in the writing of it. And this is where having a really good editor helps too, is someone coming in and reading it and saying, I think there's a little too much of your voice in here. Or I think we've had 5 pages now of description of this community. Why don't you comment on it? You know, and so with nonfiction, where the writer is a character in the story, that's kind of the whole a good bit of creative nonfiction. The writer somehow inserts herself into the story, right? And so I think for some writers that I on the page is a distant I. You know, only occasionally will you sort of get a glimpse of who that writer is. At other times, the writer is, you know, every other sentence they're engaging with someone, or their character is very alive on the page. And for me, I think it was just an unconscious process of moving back and forth between descriptions of people and occasionally inserting my own observations into it. I don't have a good formula or anything, but I think I tried to be, at least with the 4 communities I visited, I tried not to step in with sort of my judgments or, you know, I didn't like this or whatever. I think the writer's judgments come out in their choice of what to include and what to leave out. I mean, that's part of the creative process too. But in those chapters where I visited those communities, I tried to be more of the distanced I. And I had all 4 communities read what I wrote too.
Yeah. Did you get a response from people?
I was not interested in kind of plain gotcha journalism, you know, where I didn't want to go in, win these people's trust for a week, and then just shred them on the page, you know? I mean, it just felt icky to do. And that's not the kind of story I was trying to tell. If I was going to like the Republican National Convention, I might take a different tack. But yeah, this story, I wanted to walk away and have a book that any of these people could read and recognize themselves and not be angry at me. But, you know, and I think the best test, the sort of the best stamp of approval I got was when the book came out, the abbot of the monastery called and told me that they were reading it during lunch. Over a period of about 2 weeks, they would read a little bit every day during lunch. And I was just like, yeah, you know, that was one of the best things to hear. They would have had to, there's definitely some colorful language in some of the chapters, especially with some of the gang members I interviewed. So I'm sure the reader had to skip over those for the monks. Any last word?
Anybody want to ask the last question?
Yes, ma'am.
Did the beer have anything to do with Brother defection?
Did the beer?
Yes.
I did not corrupt Brother Dismas. I only...
Would he have defected, or would you have written about his defection? Or would you have written about the beer if he hadn't defected? He was still a monk.
You know, I did. I wrote about the beer because it's not illegal. It's not illegal for monks to drink beer. And in fact, many of them make very good beer in Europe. I asked the abbot, actually, I was like, why do you guys not make Trappist, you know, Trappist ale? Why are you doing mushrooms? And he said they're in the Bible Belt. It's South Carolina, you know. They'd get run out of town if a religious community was making beer in South Carolina. So they wanted to grow something more benign like mushrooms. But no, actually, it's perfectly acceptable to have a beer in a Trappist monastery. Yes, ma'am.
Any advice for beginning creative writers?
For beginning creative writers, Stick to detail and stick to scenes that you can, remembered scenes, things that you've experienced. But go for description. Go for specific details rather than. We went to the lake, and it was really fun. Show us how it was fun. We went to the lake and we hopped on water skis and we skied for 3 hours until we collapsed. But giving those concrete details, I think, is really key to creative writing. Yeah.
Can we give Fred a round of applause?
Thank you all.